Sinlaku did not become dangerous only because it was powerful. It became dangerous because over small islands like Saipan and Tinian, the storm's movement turned raw intensity into hours of repeated pressure, repeated flooding, and a recovery crisis that began before the wind had even fully pulled away. That is the part of this event that matters most. The category tells you how violent the storm can be at peak strength, but it does not fully explain why some islands come out of a landfall damaged, while others come out functionally paralyzed for days or weeks. In this case, the deeper story was not simply that Sinlaku was one of the strongest storms on the planet. The deeper story was that its motion, its pace, and its behavior near the northern Mariana Islands made the damage harder to escape, harder to assess, and much harder to recover from quickly. This is where American Skybrief becomes useful, because storms like this are often misunderstood when they are reduced to a single headline number. The real-world impact on Saipan and Tinian was shaped not only by how strong Sinlaku became, but by how long it kept these islands under serious pressure, and how effectively it disrupted the systems people rely on after landfall. That distinction matters more on small islands than it does in many mainland storms. When a major cyclone slows near an island community, the problem is no longer just wind, but duration, repetition, saturated, ground-blocked roads, delayed response, and the fact that there are far fewer fallback systems once damage begins to spread. That is why Sinlaku should not be read only as a story about an unusually strong typhoon. It should be read as a case study in how storm motion can multiply consequences, especially in places where geography limits escape routes, infrastructure redundancy, and the speed at which help can arrive. One of the most important things to understand is that islands absorb storms differently than continents. On a large landmass, damage may spread, inland mutual aid can move by road from surrounding areas, and utilities often have wider backup networks to lean on. On smaller islands, everything is tighter and more exposed. Roads, power systems, water service, fuel access, sheltering capacity, and medical facilities are often compressed into a much smaller footprint. So once the storm starts damaging those systems, failure can move quickly from one sector to the rest of next. That is exactly why the speed of a storm matters so much. A fast-moving typhoon can still be catastrophic, but a slower-moving one has more time to wear down structures, more time to drop dangerous amounts of rain, and more time to keep response crews pinned in place while conditions continue to worsen. In other words, motion turns force into consequence. A storm does not need to sit directly overhead at peak intensity for every moment to create severe outcomes, if it remains close enough to keep the same islands trapped under damaging weather for hours. That appears to be one of the defining features of Sinlaku over Saipan and Tinian. The storm did not simply pass through in a clean linear sequence, but slowed enough near the islands to prolong exposure and stretch the damage window far beyond what people tend to picture when they imagine a classic landfall. That is a major reason the reported destruction sounded so broad rather than narrowly concentrated. Roofs were ripped away, homes were damaged, trees were uprooted, vehicles were overturned, power lines came down, and roads were blocked, which is exactly the pattern you expect when an island system is being stressed long enough for multiple layers of weakness to show at once. A short burst of extreme wind can produce striking damage. But when extreme conditions last longer, the storm begins to expose not just fragile structures, but also the weak links in everything around them. Roofs that might have held a little longer begin to peel away. Trees that survive the first phase of wind start to fail as the ground softens and their roots lose grip. Power systems become more vulnerable because debris keeps accumulating while crews cannot move safely. Drainage systems lose ground because rain keeps arriving before the previous water has had time to clear. That is why category alone is never enough to explain the human side of a storm like this. Category describes intensity, but it does not tell you whether the event is moving quickly, whether rain bands are repeatedly crossing the same neighborhoods, or whether island infrastructure is being held under stress long enough to begin failing in sequence. This is especially true in places like Saipan and Tinian, where distance is small, but vulnerability is not. A road closure there is not just a traffic inconvenience, because on an island, a blocked route can interfere with ambulances, utility repair, debris removal, shelter access, and the movement of food and water all at once. The same is true for electricity. Prolonged power loss on a remote island is not just about darkness or discomfort, but about communications, refrigeration, medical equipment, fuel systems, water pumps, and whether homes that are already damaged can remain even minimally livable. Water outages deepen that crisis further. Once clean water becomes uncertain, a storm shifts from a physical emergency into a public health problem, especially when people are displaced, sanitation is disrupted, and shelter systems are already under strain. That is why the infrastructure story matters so much here. Sinlaku was not just dangerous when it was producing violent weather, but dangerous because it pushed the islands toward a point where daily life could no longer function normally, even after the center began to move away. That point becomes even more serious when medical facilities are affected. A flooded hospital is not simply another damaged building because it removes capacity from the one place a community most needs to remain operational, when injuries, stress, and emergency care needs are all increasing at the same time. Once a hospital is compromised, the entire recovery environment becomes more fragile. Patients may face delays, responders have fewer options, and the sense of instability across the community deepens because one of the core protective institutions has also taken a hit. This is one reason island storms can feel disproportionately severe compared with the size of the land area involved. A small footprint does not mean a small disaster if nearly every essential service inside that footprint is stressed together. In fact, compactness can make the problem worse. When housing, roads, utilities, clinics, and public buildings are concentrated in a limited area, a slow or lingering storm does not need to hit many places in sequence to produce a broad crisis, because so much of the system is already tightly packed together. Rainfall is another part of this event that deserves much more attention than it usually gets in category-driven coverage. Wind dominates headlines because it feels dramatic and easy to measure, but on islands, the long-term disruption often grows faster through water than through wind alone. If a storm is intense and slow, rainfall becomes a force multiplier. Streets begin to flood, drainage systems are overwhelmed, vehicles are submerged, homes are infiltrated, and cleanup becomes harder because even after the worst wind begins to ease, movement is still restricted by standing water and debris. That is how storms move from immediate impact into prolonged disruption. Flooding slows, assessment delays, supply movement increases, contamination risk, and extends the time before families can safely return to damaged homes. This is why Sinlaku's motion mattered more than a headline comparison to a major Atlantic hurricane category. The islands were not just dealing with peak wind estimates, but with a storm environment that had enough persistence to convert damage into dysfunction. That distinction is critical because dysfunction is what makes recovery drag on. A community can survive a landfall and still face a severe crisis afterward, if power, water, roads, hospitals, and housing are all compromised at the same time. This is also where island geography changes the meaning of time. On the mainland outside, crews, supplies, and replacement systems can sometimes move in from nearby regions relatively quickly once conditions improve. On remote islands, the process is slower by definition. Aid, repair teams, and equipment may depend on ports, flights, weather, windows, and intact local coordination, which means the storm's delay of a few hours can become the recovery's delay of several days or more. That is one reason Sinlaku should be understood as more than a violent weather event. It was also a logistics event because the same motion that prolonged island exposure also complicated how soon the islands could begin stabilizing once the worst conditions started to shift away. This is where the gap between meteorological language and lived experience becomes very clear. A forecast can say the storm is moving north or weakening slightly, while on the ground, people are still facing flooded roads, dark neighborhoods, limited communication, damaged roofs, and uncertain access to clean water. That is why a responsible analysis cannot stop at the moment of peak intensity. For Saipan and Tinian, the real significance of Sinlaku lies in how the storm transformed a short-term landfall threat into a longer chain of stress on nearly every essential system. The wider lesson is not that category is unimportant. The wider lesson is that category without motion, geography, and infrastructure context tells only part of the story. A powerful, fast-moving storm can devastate a community in one way. A slightly weaker but slower storm can devastate it in another. And on islands, the second pattern can be just as destructive, or even worse, because it expands the crisis beyond physical damage into prolonged operational failure. That is one of the main reasons this event deserves attention. Sinlaku showed how a storm's pace can determine whether a community absorbs a blow and begins repair, or becomes trapped in a cycle where weather, flooding, outages, and limited access keep reinforcing one another. It also shows why island preparedness has to think beyond peak wind. Strong roofs matter, but so do water systems. Backup power, hospital protection, drainage, debris, clearance communications, and plans for extended disruption rather than only the first violent hours of impact. Sheltering is part of that same conversation. When large numbers of residents move into shelters before or during a major storm, that may reduce immediate casualties. But it also reflects how vulnerable parts of the housing stock are when exposure is prolonged. And once homes take roof loss, structural damage, or flood intrusion, the problem does not end when the storm center pulls away. Temporary sheltering can quickly become displacement if repairs are slow and the local infrastructure needed to support reoccupation is still down. That is why a storm like Sinlaku has to be read on two levels at once. The first level is the weather event itself, and the second is the human systems event that begins once weather has damaged the foundations of ordinary life. The second level is often what lasts longer. Long after the dramatic satellite image fades, residents may still be dealing with blocked access, unsafe homes, school disruption, strained medical services, spoiled food, limited fuel, and the stress of uncertainty in places where resources cannot be replaced overnight. This is also why small islands often appear to suffer differently than large mainland areas under similar storm classifications. The same category number does not produce the same lived experience when one place has broad redundancy and the other has limited alternatives for transport, utilities, care, and supply. In other words, the storm does not hit an empty scale. It hits a real community with real constraints, and storm motion helps determine how deeply the storm can exploit those constraints before recovery truly begins. That is what makes Sinlaku a meaningful case. It was not important only because it was strong, but because it illustrated how prolonged exposure near islands can turn weather into a broader systems crisis. Even the public conversation around storms sometimes misses that. Viewers are trained to ask how strong it is, but for islands an equally important question is how it is moving. Is it racing through, or is it slowing enough to keep the same communities under risk for hour after hour? Is rainfall being spread out, or is it being concentrated long enough to push drainage roads and homes past their limits? Those questions often do more to explain the aftermath than a single category label. They tell you more about flood potential, infrastructure, stress response delay, and whether the island will emerge damaged or effectively stalled. The reason this matters for Sinlaku is that the storm seems to have highlighted exactly that gap between number and consequence. Peak intensity drew attention, but the prolonged pressure on Saipan and Tinian is what helps explain why the disruption was so severe and why recovery looked likely to be slow. It is also why the event should not be framed only as an unusual storm moment. It should be framed as a warning about how vulnerable island systems become when storm motion and local geography line up in the worst possible way. That warning is important because these events do not have to be historically unmatched to be deeply consequential. A storm does not need to set every record to expose serious weaknesses in housing, medical capacity, transport access, and utility resilience on small islands. What matters is whether it creates enough persistence to break the rhythm of normal life and enough disruption to keep that rhythm from restarting quickly. By that measure, Sinlaku was significant, not just as a major typhoon, but as a storm that appears to have stretched the island's recovery systems as much as their physical structures. That distinction is where the story becomes more valuable than a simple recap. Instead of seeing Sinlaku only as a powerful event, we can see it as evidence that for islands, motion often shapes consequence more decisively than viewers realize. That does not mean intensity stops mattering. It means intensity is only one part of the mechanism, and in places like Saipan and Tinian, the way a storm slows, lingers, and extends exposure can be what turns danger into prolonged hardship. So the central takeaway is not that Sinlaku was only remarkable because it was strong. The deeper takeaway is that it revealed in a very costly way how small islands can suffer when storm motion multiplies what category alone cannot fully describe. That is why this case matters beyond the immediate event. It reminds us that when evaluating tropical cyclones near island communities, the right question is not just how bad the winds may get, but how long the entire system will be forced to absorb the storm before relief can truly begin. And that may be the most useful way to understand what happened here. Sinlaku did not just strike Saipan and Tinian, it pressured them long enough to show how quickly a weather emergency can become an infrastructure emergency, and how quickly that can become a human recovery crisis. If you value weather analysis that goes beyond the biggest number on the map and explains why storms hit island communities the way they do, stay with American Sky Brief. Because sometimes the most important part of the story is not how strong the storm looked at peak, but how its motion shaped everything that followed.